Good evening. How's everyone this evening? It's wonderful to see such a large crowd for this presentation tonight. We're so delighted to welcome you to Wallace Community College. My name is Ashley Wilkins, and I'm the Dean of Institutional Services and Community Development at the college. And I bring you both greetings and apologies from Dr. Young. She wishes she could be here, but she has the flu. So we're delighted she didn't join us to share that bug with us. But she does send her regrets and asked me to welcome you on behalf of our president. Tonight we are here for a very exciting event, and we're pleased to have you on our campus for this grant project that is funded in part through the Alabama Humanities Foundation. Tonight we are honored to have Dr. Wayne Flynt, Distinguished University Professor Emeritus at Auburn University, as our keynote speaker. This humanities program is designed to pay tribute to the businesses and industries that have shaped Eufaula since the turn of the 20th century, and also to look ahead at what's to come. So we're honoring the past investment, and we're looking forward to the future. As a comprehensive community college, we at Wallace are devoted to our students and to providing them with educational opportunities so that they can contribute to the economic health and quality of life in Eufaula and the greater region. We actively seek ways to provide hands-on learning opportunities, whether it's in career technical programs or in an academic course. This project tonight represents one of the many ways that our faculty and staff work collaboratively to promote multidisciplinary approaches to teaching and learning. As I mentioned a moment ago, this project is funded in part by the Alabama Humanities Foundation. It's also funded in part by the Sparks Campus Foundation. We are so appreciative of their advocacy and their support, and I'd like to take a moment and introduce those who are here. Would you please stand? Albert Adams, and remain standing, please. Lori White, Shane Seaburn, Bob Dixon, and Mary Foy Kirkland. Can we please give them a round of applause? Again, we'd like to thank you for being here tonight, and we hope that you will revisit us soon. The college has so many activities and events, and we welcome you back anytime. Again, on behalf of Dr. Young, welcome, and now I'd like to turn the program over to Miss Amy Raspberry, who is the project director and an accounting instructor at the college. Good evening.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to introduce this humanities program on the Sparks campus tonight. We are grateful to the Alabama Humanities Foundation for funding support. I would like to say a special thank you to those who provided pictures, artifacts. A special thanks to the Wallace Committee who worked tirelessly on this project, to Dr. Marty Olaf and Mr. Doug Purcell for their constant help and encouragement. The humanities include the stories people tell, the art and music they make, the buildings they live in and work in. In short, the humanities include all of those things that make us human and more humane. The subjects that make up the humanities, history, music, art, languages, philosophy, religion, and literature, do not merely provide a record of human civilization, they provide an interpretation or a way of looking at events in the past. The traveling exhibition, entitled A Local History of Eufaula, Where Have We Been and Where Are We Going?, contains photo panels and artifacts to chronicle Eufaula's economic history from 1900 to present day. It will provide a stroll down memory lane, illustrating Eufaula's resilience as we travel visually through time. It is our hope that you not only will learn how people lived in earlier times and made their living, and how our community lived and made them the people they were, but will gain more insight into the community we live in now and how this community makes us the kind of people we are. We hope that you will be enlightened as we revisit and remember the past, those economic challenges, but also our successes of Eufaula, and we look towards and envision our future. After the initial exhibition on the Sparks campus, the panels will travel a circuit which includes venues in Eufaula and Dothan. Our expectation is to share this event with over 2,500 people. Wallace Community College is pleased to welcome our lecturer tonight, Dr. Wayne Flynt. Professor Emeritus at Auburn University, Dr. Flynt grew up primarily in Alabama and graduated from Anniston High School in 1958. He attended Samford University as a ministerial student where he double majored in history and speech. He received his PhD in American history from Florida State University in 1965. 3 of Dr. Flynt's 13 books are broad surveys of Alabama history, including 2 of his most acclaimed, Poor But Proud, Alabama's Poor Whites, and Alabama in the 20th Century. Following Dr. Flynt's discussion, panelists for the evening include Mr. Billy Houston, Mr. Jay Jackson, and Mr. Doug Purcell. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce and turn the microphone over to Dr. Wayne Flynt.
Thank you, Amy. If it won't bother you too much, I'm going to spend most of my time out here. So instead of thinking of me as lecturing to you, it will perhaps bring you into the conversation more. And if you think of it as sort of a conversation, I think it would be a lot better. First of all, I want to thank Kay and Amy because I have never seen a project that has unfolded as well as this one has. And the levels of importance here, first of all, the oral history collection so that people who are local can tell their own stories so that you can both know those stories and preserve those stories for your children and grandchildren, because the ability to preserve them is to some degree the key to how you survive as a town. People sometimes stay in a town even when their heads tell them they ought to go elsewhere because their hearts are rooted in that place. So that, for instance, when people tell me they wished if I didn't like Alabama, I'd leave it, I tell them I like it okay. My people have been here 7 generations, and so why don't you get out because you came later than I did. So I intend to stay and because I love it, because my heart is here and the stories are here, the stories of my family. So you have those stories now. Second thing, the panels. I think Kay and Amy had a lot to do with the panels, and I just want to say that there must be a sense of clairvoyance here. I know there's something in the water that makes everybody in Monroeville write books, and maybe here in Eufaula, it's your capacity to think exactly like I do about what's important. Because separately, I was writing this lecture while Amy and Kay were doing the panels, and when Amy sent me the panels, I said, it's incredible. Virtually everything on those panels is something I'm going to say here, which means that I could just stay home and you could just look at the panels and you'd be fine. In addition to that, I want to say a word or two about the town of Eufaula. I don't know how many times I've been here, but lots. And at least once every month or two, when Louise Connor was alive, my wife and I would drive over and we would take her to her favorite soul food restaurant in Lumpkin, Georgia, and have turnip greens and sweet potato casserole and cornbread. And actually they served buttermilk, which is my bottom line for a good soul food restaurant. She liked it too, so we fell in love with Louise. So you have this great presence in our life. And you may know or not know that the novel Now Lost that Harper Lee wrote on the Reverend, which was a gruesome murder in Alexander City, she actually finished at Louise Connor's dining table here in Eufaula. And I don't know what happened to it. And hopefully someday we will, because Louise said it was better than In Cold Blood or To Kill a Mockingbird, which is saying a whole lot. So this is really a special place. I think it's the most beautiful town in Alabama. And if I were just reinventing myself to go to one place and live, it would be here. And Doug Purcell and all of you have done such a great job with historic preservation, and I'm going to talk about that at the end. I'm going to do this in 4 parts. One, I'm going to talk about King Cotton, because that's what made you in the first place. Secondly, I'm going to talk about your ability to adapt to a new world are born in, and that's the textile industry. And you'll have to help me here. Kaigi mill? Kaigi mill? Kaigi? All right. I'm going to get that right because I've been corrected so many times, especially by David Alsabrook, whose father worked out there. He said, if you're going to talk about where my ancestors live, say it right. I know they're Indians, but I don't know how to pronounce it properly. I'm also going to talk about the sense of community here, which is really special. And I'm going to use examples of that. And then I'm going to talk about your ability to adapt to change and your ability to fight respectably, i.e. 431, and what happens to the medium. And what that tells you from the standpoint of someone from Anniston, Alabama, where I grew up, and where they cut all the trees down and we lost Quintard. And it became all businesses. We lost all the historic buildings along it. And now Anniston has nothing to preserve, which is a tragedy. And I'll get to that too in a minute. Okay, let me go back to start. Cotton. I brought the book, but I'm going to summarize it for you. And I know you're going to be glad to know that I'm going to summarize it for you because it's much too long for you to read. Sven Berkert, I know that doesn't sound like a name of somebody who would write about cotton, right? Sven Berkert. He's not from around here, in case you wonder. He is an economic historian at Harvard. He worked for a generation on this book, and this is the best book ever written about cotton. Now, if you want to read about cotton in India and the Indus Valley 3,000 years before Christ, that's where it all started. Believe it or not, it's Indian. And then it goes across the ocean gradually, and it winds up in the South. So that's the story I want to tell you. He says in the first part of this book, I'll quote his sentence, cotton was the core ingredient of the world's most important manufacturing industry. And I know you sort of believe that if you live in Barbour County, and it's sort of in your blood. But after a while you think, is that really true? Or is that just sort of a fiction that my high school history teacher taught me about how important Eufaula and Barbour County are? No, that's the truth. Let me summarize some of his evidence. By the early part of the 19th century, cotton was responsible for 1 in every 65 persons who lived on the globe's employment. Can you start off there? 1 of every 65 people anywhere in the world either grew it, or ginned it, or warehoused it, or transported it, or spun it, or made something with it. In England, which was the largest textile manufacturer in the world in the middle of the 19th century, 1 out of every 4 jobs derived from cotton, and 1 in every $10 invested anywhere in the world by Brits was invested in cotton. Sometimes in the South, sometimes in Britain, sometimes in other countries. France had a large textile industry. Russia had a large textile industry. The Brits helped them develop their industry. 1 out of 4 jobs in England. Not only that, but by the early part of the 19th century, the center for cotton production was not India, where it had begun 3,000 years before Christ. It was in the American South. There are 3 reasons for that. Number 1, great soil. And I'm going to get to Barbour County and its soil in just a minute. Number 2, servile labor, because growing cotton is a nasty business. If you don't believe it, I'd like for you to listen to my father's oral history or my grandfather's oral history. My grandfather was a sharecropper in Calvin County, could not read and write, and grew cotton. My father grew it until he was 18 years old and decided he didn't want to grow any more cotton in his life. And so he dropped out of high school, never to finish, in 1937, and went to work in a steel mill in Birmingham because he was tired of growing cotton. So the lineage of this industry in the South is pretty deep, and it's based on good land, servile labor, and easy credit. Easy credit because there was no industry or agriculture in which you could make more money over a shorter period of time than growing cotton in the 19th century. So British banks knew they were not taking much of a chance when they loaned money to Southerners to buy land and to grow cotton. By the time you get to the 1830s, when America has 1 million slaves growing cotton, and the South is producing 40% of all exports sold by the United States. That's a pretty big number. 40% of all U.S. exports by the 1830s consist of cotton grown in the South. Furthermore, if you want to look at shipping and navigation and shipbuilding, the number one port in the United States was New York City. The number two port was New Orleans. The number three port was Mobile. And the number four port, are you ready for this? Apalachicola, Florida. I mean, you can't get your head around that if you've been to Apalachicola lately, right? It doesn't look all that dramatic. And you know what it's draining? It's draining the Chattahoochee and Flynt rivers, named, of course, in my honor. So the Flynt's coming out of Georgia and the Chattahoochee's coming down here, and cotton is going south. Now, if you don't believe that cotton is important after what I've told you, here's some more evidence. By the 1830s, and then the 40s, 50s, 60s, same way, early 60s, if you look at where white wealth exists in America, if I were to ask you a question now, you'd probably say Connecticut, Seattle, Washington State, New York City, so forth. Here are the states and the rankings of white wealth owned by Americans at a time when 1 out of every 5 jobs in the United States depended on cotton, and where the value of slaves was $1.3 billion by 1850, and that was 1/5 of the entire investment in America altogether. 1/5 of it consists of the value of slaves, which tells you something about what's happening in the economy. State number 1, South Carolina, wealthiest state for whites in the United States. State number 2, Mississippi. State number 3, Louisiana. State number 4, Florida. State number 5, Connecticut. State number 6, Alabama. State number 7, Texas, right through the South. In fact, of the top 8 states, the only outlier is Connecticut. You know how Connecticut gets there? They manufacture cotton gins and cotton equipment and ships to send it over. So basically, all 8 states that are the wealthiest states for whites depend upon cotton in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. During that period of time, for instance, take the 1850s, when cotton production doubles from 2 million bales in 1850 to 4 million bales in 1860, doubling in 1 decade. And if you want evidence of this, go over to West Alabama and just drive through the area that has not changed very much and see the Greek Revival mansions, almost every one of which dates from 1850 to 1860, during the opulent high watermark of cotton cultivation in Alabama. Yes, in Alabama, because whereas the wealth had been centered in other southern states, older southern states primarily, along with Louisiana and Mississippi by the 1830s, by the 1850s it shifted to Alabama because the land's worn out up the eastern seaboard. So the centers shifted here. You start off with the Tennessee Valley and the slaves along the valley, and the cotton was shipped on the Tennessee River to the Cumberland River, the Ohio River, downriver on the Mississippi, and shipped out of New Orleans. And then gradually after the First Creek War, after 1814, they opened the Black Belt west of the Coosa River and the Alabama River, and all of a sudden the Black Belt that you know over there is created, and then the Second Greek War, and they open this area, and Barbour County becomes a state in county in 1832, and then the cotton shifts in this direction. and the Chattahoochee Valley becomes the conduit for carrying it down to Apalachicola. By that time, if you start with 1850, 50% of all U.S. exports, we're up now, 50% of all U.S. exports consist of cotton. I'm sorry, 1860. And in 1860, the decade before 1850, Alabama produced 23% of all cotton exported in the United States. So 50% of all U.S. exports consist of cotton, 23% comes from Alabama, most from the Black Belt. Tennessee Valley's completely eclipsed, and it's coming from the Black Belt. By 1860, the figure is 18% of all U.S. cotton came from Alabama. 1870, 14% of all U.S. cotton is coming from Alabama. So you see our percentage is going down, and that's the reason why now Texas is becoming a major wealthy state, because East Texas, with very fertile land, is beginning to grow lots of cotton, and the Mississippi Delta has been opened as well. You see the argument? The argument is that this county and Eufaula were simply subparts of this vast drama. You were one act in this huge play. And certainly by the heyday of Eufaula and Barbour County, it was a cotton-producing juggernaut. In fact, the first Alabama state geologist, Eugene Smith, wrote a description of Barbour County in 1882. And in fact, it's in Maddie Thompson's book. If you know Maddie Thompson's wonderful book on the history of Barbour County, she quotes this report from the U.S. and Alabama Geological Surveys, and this is what Smith wrote about Barbour County. The sandy soil and heavy dew are favorable to the growth of cotton. Cotton occupies 4/5 of the cultivated land of Barbour County, and the height of the stalk is 3 to 4 feet. The northern part of the county has calcareous soil with a substratum of marl and limestone. Southern Barbour soils are a bit sandy, but are pronounced to be some of the finest cotton lands in the state of Alabama. So that's the grand day. As a matter of fact, there are more than a few Barbour Countyans who really feel everything's been downhill since 1865. It was sort of the glory days are back then. And you can understand why. Look at the houses, look at the warehouses, look at the river, think of the romance of this story, and think of the old days, the glory days of the old regime, and it seems really great. I would just warn you that there's a downside to every story in history. For instance, millions and millions of Irishmen and others who came to America in those decades before the Civil War did not settle here where the weather was good and where land was easily acquired. And the reason they didn't settle here is because they didn't want to compete with servile labor. If you got a labor supply of slaves, why would free labor ever want to come here and farm? Because they're at such a disadvantage. So when people came from Europe to settle in the decades between 1800 and 1860, generally they stayed north, which is the reason at a time when both areas, south and north, were about equal in population. By the Civil War, the north is twice as heavily populated as the south because the immigration goes that direction. Because of the weather and because of the labor force, they could not compete on the grounds that was the most important grounds economically in the world, which was growing cotton. So what did? They manufactured stuff like cotton gins and all sorts of other stuff. And I know about Daniel Pratt and Prattville, but that's an exception to the rule that Southerners really had contempt for industrial labor and working inside in factories. And you might remember that actually Daniel Pratt was not from these parts. He was from up in Vermont. So the truth of the matter is, most of the industrialists in the South were not Southern born. They just came here to create industry. But basically, we didn't like industry very much, and we thought cotton was king. On the eve of the Civil War, the South thought the South could win the war, despite the fact they were outnumbered 2-1 and much heavier than that if you just count white population. And the reason they thought they would win is because the world could not do without Southern cotton. You know why? 77% of all the cotton turned into textiles in Britain on the eve of the Civil War came from the South. 90% of the cotton used in French textile mills came from the South. 92% of the cotton used in Russian textile mills came from the South. If you can imagine getting on a boat in Mobile and winding up in Russia, yep, that happened all the time. And in France, yep, and England especially. And the entire Midlands of England was dependent upon cotton. So the South's attitude is, if we can just hold out long enough, the English will have to enter the war on our behalf because we're going to destroy them, because the blockade will cut off all their cotton and they won't have a textile industry. And where four-fifths of their people work, and therefore their people will rise up and say, help the South, because otherwise we lose our jobs and our economic future. Well, when you gamble big, you can lose big. And we lost just about as big as you can ever lose when you make a bet based on arrogance and hubris. Now, I want to shift altogether. We're not going to talk about cotton. I'm done with cotton. We're going to talk about a sense of community. And I want to I could pick lots of institutions which have that sense of connectedness. But I'm going to pick one that I've written lots about, because years ago I was commissioned to write a history of Alabama Baptist. And I know some of you think, oh my Lord, don't tell me we're going to have to listen about Baptists today. Well, yes, you are. In another life, I was a Baptist minister, and I like them a lot. And I've had friends who were pastors at First Baptist Eufaula. And so I want to tell you a story about First Baptist Eufaula. And this is the story. Number one, it is one of the most important churches in Antebellum, Alabama. It has one of the largest Sunday schools in any church of any denomination in the state of Alabama in 1860. It is, without question, the most important political church in the state of Alabama other than First Baptist Church in Montgomery, the capital, which was maybe a little bit more important because all the legislators went to that church when they were there. But the Sunday school here was terrific. It was very large in an age in which most churches didn't even have a Sunday school. It met every Sunday in an age in which most churches met only once a month. So it's really an important church. Not only that, but it has some really important members, very powerful members, like John Gill Shorter. And I'm sure all of you in the audience know that John Gill Shorter was not only a Baptist, but a deacon at First Baptist Church, and a very influential deacon at that. I don't know that you knew that about half the congregation of First Baptist Church, Eufaula, was African American. And I bet almost none of you knew that almost uniquely among all the Baptist congregations in the state of Alabama in the antebellum period, they had a black church conference and a white church conference. And the idea was white people won't fool with black people in matters of discipline or anything else, and black people won't fool with white people in matters of discipline or anything else. Let me give you an example. Back in the 1840s, there was a pastor at First Baptist Eufaula by the name of Jonathan Davis, who apparently was a stem-minding preacher, but not too careful with his personal conduct. And so, in the church minutes, which are at Samford University, there is a charge filed against Brother Davis, which accused him of I won't read this so you don't think I'm making this up. Immoral intimacy. Immoral intimacy. And when I read that, I thought, that sounds really interesting for a Baptist preacher. This may be a more interesting book than I thought it was going to be. So I began to do some research on this charge of immoral. And as it turns out, there is a slave woman who is also a member of Eufaula First Baptist Church by the name of Lisi. Incidentally, in almost all Baptist churches in this period, if you're a slave, you don't have a last name. You're just Lisi, servant of. And so you don't have a last name. If you're a free black, they give you a last name. And incidentally, Eufaula had free black members as well as slave members, but Lisi was a slave of a white member of Eufaula First Baptist Church. And so this immoral intimacy occurred when Pastor Davis and Lisi are out by themselves walking in the outskirts of Eufaula, and he is accused and admits to imprudence and indiscretion in conversations, walking and talking with Lisi the slave. He is charged by, and tried by the White Conference, and he is found to be guilty of imprudence and indiscretion, and so they temporarily dismiss him as pastor, and he preaches at different churches during this brief interval of being not pastor of the church, until finally they bring the charges up again, and by a very close vote, he is acquitted, and he becomes pastor again. Now, it's very interesting that you remember there are two conferences, right? There's a black conference and a white conference. Well, the owner of Lisi charges her before the black conference of having immoral intimacy with Pastor Davis. And the black conference tries her, and her master reports to the black conference that she has a long tradition of seducing white men. Apparently that was not a hard thing to do in Eufaula at the time. And since this was a pattern, the black conference kicks her out. Now you clear here, the white conference has cleared the pastor of charges which the black conference finds her guilty of and expels her from the congregation. The white congregation, the white conference then, has a meeting in which they restore him as pastor, with Lisi now removed from the church, until 2 years later when a delegation from a former pastorate in Georgia arrives at Eufaula First Baptist to inform them that when he was pastor over in Georgia, he was brought before the church for charges of immoral intimacy with a slave woman, so apparently this is a pattern. At which point the white conference at Eufaula First Baptist follows the pattern of the black conference and kicks him out of the church. I bet you didn't know Baptist, well, yeah, you do too. Now, John Gill Shorter's role in this was not really very significant, but all of a sudden he comes on the stage about this time. He is now an adult. He is a deacon in the church. And John Gill Shorter really becomes disturbed because a whole series of really well-trained Baptist ministers come to Eufaula because they like the town and they like the church, and it is one of the most prestigious churches in the Deep South. But they come here and they stay a few years and then they leave because they can't live on the salary y'all paid down here. I understand this. That was during my Baptist ministerial era, that Baptists don't pay very well. So even school teachers do better than Baptist preachers generally in Alabama. So John Gill Shorter gets really angry that they're having this parade of really skilled people coming here as pastor and then leaving. So John Gill Shorter proposes something kind of unique among all Baptist churches that I studied, and I studied hundreds of them in writing the Alabama Baptist book. And Eufaula was so fascinating that I made it one of the 10 churches that I just follow all the way through history. And partly because John Gill Shorter says, I think we ought to pay the pastor in a different way because the deacons have been in charge of raising money and that's been a failure. So what I want to do is create a finance committee. And what the finance committee will do is the first of each year, the finance committee will receive an estimate from each male member of what his net worth is, how much money he made selling cotton that year. And based upon that, we will assess him a pro rata share of what it takes to run the church and hire and keep good pastors. Well, you have to really appreciate the hard-headedness of Baptists in general, and apparently Eufaula Baptist in particular, to be told that you have to tell a finance committee how much you're worth. And then the finance committee, based upon what you tell them, will then charge you. I mean, this is not a voluntary tithe, right? They're saying you're going to give us such and such amount of money based upon the wealth you have. So a lot of Baptist men who own cotton land in Eufaula Baptist Church said, I ain't going to do it. To which John Gill Shorter said, that's fine, we'll just do it for you. we'll tell you how much we think you're worth, and it'll probably be more than you think you're worth, but you have a choice of either telling us or we will tell you, and we'll just pro rata, we'll charge you. Well, I don't have to tell you that most of the men began to turn in their own estimate because they didn't want John Gill Shorter and the finance committee to tell them what they thought they were worth. Therefore, you had the best pastors you can imagine because of the way in which you financed their salary for a decade. Not only that, but you remember the black and white conferences and the fact that they governed each other separately. Something really interesting happened because the blacks were very poor, the free blacks as well as the slaves, of course. And so they began to argue that a fairly significant portion of the total revenue raised at Eufaula should not be spent overseas or on foreign missions or on the building or carpets or whatever, but should be spent on poor people within the congregation. And so Eufaula First Baptist became a sort of trendsetter in taking the money they were raising and sharing it with the congregation based upon need, the black congregation as well as the white congregation. In fact, I found a record in 1859 when the black congregation, which of course was made up of slaves primarily, and they had very little money at all, and they donated $12 for missions in Africa because they thought the Africans needed help more than they did, which is kind of wonderful, isn't it? Kind of an incredible story of people sharing what little they have with people across the seas from where their ancestors came to Eufaula. Well, then the Southern Baptist Convention was created in 1845, and I know this is going to shock you too, but the Baptists of Eufaula could not agree on whether the Southern Baptist Convention was a good thing or a bad thing. Because some said this is an example of Southern nationalism and our independence and our free thinking, and so it's a good thing, but others said this. Baptists have a way of fighting an argument all the time, as you know. And in this particular case, the member said, I think it is not a good thing that we create a new Baptist convention. I dissent from this. I regret the establishment of a separate Southern Baptist convention, thus severing the body of Christ, thus duplicating programs, thus wasting resources and deepening sectional divisions between North and South. I found that really interesting at the very time when Southerners overwhelmingly were trying to separate themselves from the North. There's this Baptist layman here in Eufaula with some followers who say that. And when the Civil War began, it's kind of interesting what happened. First of all, you remember the deacon, John Gill Shorter, in 1861, he's elected governor, so he's governor of Alabama during the period that the war begins, the first 2 years of the war. And not only that, but during that period of time, you have a spellbinding pastor of the church named W.N. Reeves, R-E-E-V-E-S. Reeves was a phenomenal preacher, but he was also, according to the Alabama Baptists, one of the handsomest men in Alabama, so at least the Eufaula church women always look upon an agreeable object when he is preaching to them. I can truthfully say that having read thousands of church reports, I have never read a single report that talked about how much women generally went to church in order to gaze on the pastor. But it may be that there's something to this, because when W.N. Reeves decided to resign as pastor of the church and form a company of infantry here in Eufaula, which consisted incidentally of many male members of his church, and marched off to war, the ladies decided to take the carpet in the church, which incidentally was rare as hen's teeth. No Baptist church had carpet in that period. And they ripped up the carpet and they sent the carpet to the Confederate Army to be torn up into pieces and to be used as blankets for Confederate soldiers. And I always had a hunch that some of the women probably had a crush on Reverend Reeves and hoped the blanket they gave was the blanket that he used. But at any rate, I don't know that for sure. But changed the theology of the church too. For instance, in 1 minute, the church says that they want to placate an angry God by tightening discipline, expelling miscreants, and declaring repentance of all the members. And then in the minute they said, Baptists have ever been a peculiar people. There was never greater truth written than that. Baptists have ever been a peculiar people in their unflinching adherence to all the commands and teachings of the Word of God. And so the reason they were losing on the battlefield was because they had lost the battle of morality back home, according to this reasoning. Incidentally, of all the people I've run across in Eufaula, the one that intrigues me most is a woman named Elizabeth Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S. Elizabeth Rhodes was a very prominent woman, her husband, wealthy, member of Eufaula First Baptist Church. She and her husband were good friends of the Reeves, and they had them over for dinner frequently, and they were good social friends. And during the Civil War, Elizabeth Rhodes kept a diary. The diary is now at the archives at Samford University, and I would urge you, if you ever get a chance to go to Birmingham, go and see the Elizabeth Rhodes diary. And actually, one of my graduate students at Auburn actually wrote a dissertation about Elizabeth Rhodes, and you'll see why in just a minute. In her diary, she not only talks about local people who go off to war and don't come back, but she also talks about the providential care of God. It's strongly Calvinist theology. And for instance, she says, if we don't repent of our sins, it will not produce better results on the battlefields, no matter how courageous our armies. And when a young physician in Eufaula, who had just graduated from the University of North Carolina Medical School, went off to war and was killed in his first battle, she writes in her diary, sort of Calvinist resolution of his life, he was cut off on just entering his long life of usefulness by an overruling providence that saw fit to remove him. And we should not reminisce. Move on. Life like a piece of wheat cut by a scythe. Then she talked about Pastor Reeves' last sermon before he went off to war, based on Psalm 99. His text, the words, clouds and darkness are all around us. Righteousness and judgment are the tribulation of his times. Boy, talk about prescient, about what's going to happen in the next 2 years. But survive, Barbour County did. And believe it or not, by 1900, the South was producing twice as much cotton as it had produced in 1860. As the world population boomed and the need for cotton now grown in the Indus Valley of India and shipped through Calcutta and grown in Egypt and Brazil was supplemented by the cotton grown once again in Barbour County, where cotton was once again king of the economy. Until about 1890, when all of a sudden a transition occurred. And the transition was Eufaula Cotton Mill. Now, in a way, you'll probably say, well, what difference did it make? Whether it was cotton grown or cotton warehoused or cotton shipped or cotton ginned, because it's all about cotton, and Eufaula Cotton Mill was all about cotton. So it's not so much of a transition. Well, it's really quite a dramatic transition, and here's the reason. Because all of a sudden you go from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and you know that's what we didn't want, right? Because the best life was life on the land, and you grow things, and now all of a sudden you're inside a factory all day, and it's hot, and cotton lint is all around you all day long. And it was awful. It was absolutely awful. The reports of Eufaula Cotton Mill are like so many others from the 4 largest cotton milling states now. Textile states, largest one, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, 4 largest textile states. So you've gone from producing cotton to now making it into textiles yourself, not sending it to England. And the result of this is that you have tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, like my grandfather, who were sharecroppers producing that cotton in the 1890s, who were looking for something better because the land was worn out, because they couldn't make a go of it, because they were always falling deeper and deeper in debt. And as a consequence of that, they began to think in terms of go into a cotton mill and beginning to work there. Give you an idea of what is called the family wage. The family wage was so low that a head of family, male, who worked in a cotton mill, and incidentally, they weren't good textile workers. Generally, women were better because the dexterity of their fingers, especially in handling the thread, was so much better. So the loom people were always good. The males who were hired generally tend to be the fixers, the mechanics who repaired equipment, but the women were good. This is really amazing because all of a sudden women now either deserted, divorced, widowed, too young to marry, found a place where they could make a living for themselves. Eufaula, cotton mill, classic example. And because the salaries were predicated on the idea that the male worked but did not make enough to take care of large families, and the families were very large. My grandmother's family was 18. The storytelling aunt said, your grandmother was the 10th in the first batch. And I was thinking biscuits coming out of the oven. I mean, what is this first batch stuff? And she said, oh, her mother died in childbirth when your grandmother was born. And then he remarried because he needed somebody to take care of 10 children. And she had 8 more, and so there were 18 children. And my dad was one of 8 children. We had big populations here. And what are you going to do with all these mouths to feed? Because a man doesn't make enough at Eufaula cotton mill to take care of that. So the idea was everybody in the family has to work. The man worked, the woman worked, all the children worked, as soon as they were old enough to get in the mill. Just to give you an idea, in 1900, there were roughly 1,000 textile workers in Alabama who were between the ages of 10 and 13. And I found lots and lots of examples of 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds working 10-hour shifts 6 days a week. With all the health problems associated with that, with the loss of literacy because they can't go to school. And I want to give you some examples of this from interviews done in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, because 4 of the interviews were done here at the mills in Eufaula. And when I read them, I just couldn't believe the stories. The first one is Nancy Nolan. Some of you may know Nancy Nolan. She had 3 sons. Her husband died when the oldest one was 9. They lived in Dale County. For 5 years, she tried to sharecrop with her 9-year-old son and her as primary laborers, and the little kids, not much help. After 5 years, she decided there was no hope of making a living that way, so she moves into Eufaula. She goes to work at the mill. And during the ensuing years, 2 of the sons are put in the mill and work with her. The younger son goes to school. So 3 of them are working, so 1 of them can go to school. And the last time I talked in Eufaula, there were 2 men who hung around after all of you talked to me about your ancestors at the end of the lecture. And I could tell that they really wanted to wait until I finished because they wanted to talk to me. Maybe one of them's still here alive, I hope so. But at any rate, one of them had on overalls, and he ran a service station here down on the end of town, north end of town. And the other one was dressed in a designer suit. And I thought, this is a strange pair. Well, it turned out the one in the designer suit had gone to Boston University, and he had gotten a PhD in psychology, and he was a counselor, psychologist in Boston. And he had come home to visit his brother because I had mentioned their mother, Nancy Nolan, in the book Poor But Proud, where I mentioned all these Eufaula textile workers. And he said, I just wanted to tell you the story. Our mother is listed on page, he had every page where I had mentioned her, Nancy Nolan. He said, that's our mother. And I'm the one who went to school. And this is my brother, who did not say a word. He just sort of shook his head when he was introduced. And he said, this is my brother who worked in Goika mills in order to make sure that I got to go to school in Eufaula. And then that made it possible for me to get my PhD. And our brother is dead. Our older brother, the one who started at 9 in the mill, is dead. But the 2 of us are still alive. Interesting story, isn't it? I took some quotes from the story of Nancy Nolan about her sons. But I thought I would read you a quotation from the Alabama Development Brochure in the 1890s to try to get the mills to come to Alabama. The state of Alabama commissioned a man named Saffold Burney to write a little brochure about recruiting textile mills to Alabama. I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs from the manual. This is, think of economic development people who are trying to sell a community or a state. This is what he wrote. It is astonishing how rapidly these little folks, 7, 8, 9 years old, learn to keep up an end, to piece a yarn, to spin, to reel, to warp, to weave, to perform the multifarious duties which go to make up the daily routine of a well-ordered cotton mill. It is a sight gratifying to any philanthropist to see 80 or 100 comfortably dressed, well-fed, cheerful little people of both sexes engaged in their daily duties, bright, cheerful, good-tempered, orderly, obedient young folks as they pass rapidly among their exquisite machines, sometimes singing in concert and absolutely content. The very people who've all their lives had nothing to do before except idleness. Strikes are unknown among these really worthy people who fill their appropriate squares in the great chessboard of life dutifully and gladsomely as good citizens, as much worthy of respect and consideration as the merchant princes of this land. Well, that was written in the 1890s, but by 1934, apparently, the gladsome, contented, and cheering little children had suddenly grown angry because the largest strike in American history began in a textile mill in Huntsville, Alabama, and quickly spread across the state. And before long, there were 250,000 textile workers, not only on strike, but they were out in front of textile mills with Winchesters. And in fact, at places where they didn't have the union, here, or in Opelika, or in the Chattahoochee Valley, there were flying squads from Phoenix City who would come, and the flying squad would get outside the mill and tell workers, come out of your jobs, and call them scabs. And in the case of the Chattahoochee Valley, I ran across the story of a company doctor who was called to deliver a baby late one night and went through a guard post without proper identification, and they shot at him, and he was the company doctor. Or their Opelika Mills had a machine gun from World War I posted outside, and a warning that any flying squad that came from Phoenix City would be immediately shot if they came on Opelika manufacturing property. So, you know, things are not going so well. But guess where they did go well? They went well in Opelika. Opelika, Eufaula. And you know the reason they went well in Eufaula? Anybody have any idea why it wasn't like this year? Donald Comer. Donald Comer was, without question, the most philanthropic, social, gospel-oriented textile leader in the South, in my opinion. He was, in fact, during the 1930s, head of the Alabama Relief Administration, the New Deal's administration of relief for the population of the state. His father, B.B. Comer, a native of this county, a former governor, one of the founders of the textile industry, Avondale Mills was his empire. Donald Comer, his son, took over the company. He bought the mills here in Eufaula, and he turned them into like a family. And that's the reason I entitled this part of it, A Sense of Community. Those of you who know anything about the Mill Village, about South Side or South Randolph Street, know that he came to graduations from school. He had a kindergarten for poor kids to go to school free. He provided scholarships to go to college, including my father-in-law, who was a Baptist minister and worked at Avondale Mills in Sylacauga, because there was no high school in his community. And every school, even public schools, had tuition that you had to pay. In the case of my father-in-law, he worked 1 year at Avondale Mills, went to school the 9th grade, then he worked another year, 10th grade, another year, 11th grade, another year, 12th grade, and at the age of 24 finished high school, having paid his tuition. And then Donald Comer gave him a scholarship. He was so impressed with him to go to Howard College, Samford University, become a pastor, and ultimately to get a doctorate and become one of the most important Baptist pastors in Alabama. That is my story, but that story is replicated 1,000 times here in Eufaula. He created the community club. He created the lighted playground. He created the ornamental gardens. He started 3 different bands. He started baseball teams. And it's probably the first time that mill people and uptown people, as they were called, people north Eufaula and south Eufaula, actually met as social equals. Because on a baseball field, if you got a good curveball, nobody cares whether you live in North Eufaula or South Eufaula. Doesn't make a bit of difference. So this transition that moved into a world where there were violent strikes and bloodshed all over the South, but not here in Eufaula. And I recorded some interesting comments from this story. Mrs. Lee Snipes, some of you may have known Mrs. Snipes, story like Nancy Nolan, except her husband was an alcoholic who abandoned the family and she had to move into town to take care of the children. She said, when I moved here, this was when it was Eufaula Cotton Mill, she said, I worked a 12-hour shift for subsistence wages, and the only toilet was a filthy outdoor toilet that was never managed. When Mr. Comer purchased the mill, conditions changed. He installed decent toilets, 5 commodes, all cleaned every day. You know, it's interesting in an oral history, what you record. But if you've ever been to an outdoor toilet, I have. And my uncles and aunts, I thought, were the most barbaric people I'd ever seen because I came from the town and they didn't have indoor toilets. I know what that's like. So that 5 toilets cleaned every day really impressed me too. And then she said, workers in each department wore uniforms of different colors. And then there's Tom Alsabrook, who many of you know through David Alsabrook, who wrote the article in your local paper about the mill. Tom Alsabrook, David's father, said he installed new machinery and modernized the plant. He sold houses to employees, and he lent children of mill workers money to go to college. Life was not easy, but I liked Comer, and I liked working in the mills. Nancy Nolan again. I especially liked Mr. Comer because he allowed workers to buy the houses. Mrs. Champion. The sentiments of the other 3 are exactly hers too. Despite her own illiteracy and her husband's alcoholism, she made a living, bought her house, loved Donald Comer in the mill. Mrs. Snipes again contrasted the worlds that had resulted from greed and paternalism elsewhere. And then she said, it used to be here in Eufaula, we were just factory folk or we were lint heads. Now we are mill operatives, and we hold our heads up high. All work is honorable, you know, and we are proud of ours. At the mills, my work has just been all happiness. So you have wars other places, and here you have this deep sense of community. That's pretty remarkable. Then there are the transitions, and here I want to talk about Highway 421. 431, sorry about that. 431. I have a theory about towns that survive. Towns that survive are towns that have the ability to talk about their differences, get over them, and work together. And I can tell you all sorts. I can tell you a town that's dying right now because it can't get over its disagreements over Harper Lee. That's Monroeville, Alabama. They're fighting each other so hard that they can't see a common destiny. And I keep trying to tell them that your population in Monroe County peaked in 1900, and your population in Monroeville peaked in 1990, and Vanity Fair is now in China. And you got no future unless you can get together and work. You got 6,300 people. And the person who was going to save you just died 3 months ago. And unless you get together, you got no future. So if you think back to Barbour County had 31,000 people in 1860. It had 36,000 people roughly in 1900. It has 27,000 people now, according to the Online Encyclopedia of Alabama. You're fairly stable. But like almost every county in the Black Belt, your population peaked in 1900. And you've got about 50-50 black and white, And so that's your labor force. Not only that, but whites are not reproducing themselves because white women go to school and then they go to college and then they don't get married until they're 30 like my daughter-in-laws, and then they don't have but 1 or 2 children like my 2 daughter-in-laws. And so the result of that, we don't even reproduce ourselves. There are 3 Flynt grandchildren in 2 families. And that's not even reproducing yourself. And I tell people all the time in speeches like this, if you want to keep America white, which a lot of Alabamians do, best thing you could do is give every woman of color a scholarship to go to college, because they'll go to college and they won't have children until they're in their 30s, and then whites will have more population. So if you just give all the black women the high school, college scholarships, that'll make sure that the demography changes, because right now the demography is headed for a school system in Alabama that in 2017 will be majority minority, and your labor force is going to be black and Hispanic, and you don't have enough people to do the jobs to make this a viable state. I'll tell you a corporate executive's name I will not tell you, but it's a very powerful corporation in Alabama that hires lots and lots of people, some at low technical areas, some at high technical areas. And he said if we eliminated everybody who can't pass a drug test and everybody who can't read a simple manual of how to do something, we could not get enough people in the state of Alabama to continue this company. We'd have to move it someplace else. Or I can tell you another story. When I facilitated the equity funding lawsuit and the education reform program, and when I spoke here in Eufaula about those subjects, I had a corporate executive from a steel company who called me. He was from Massachusetts, had just become CEO of a steel company. He called and said, "Dr. Flynt, I want you to tell me something. I hire nobody except high school graduates, and my high school graduates can't read." He said, "Can you explain to me how it is you can be a high school graduate in Alabama and can't read?" This is 1993. And I said, "I don't know, but I'll find out, because I've got a former student from Sanford who works at the State Department of Education." So I'll call him. I called him. I said, "Got this call. I'm going to call him back. I want to know, why is it that students who graduate with a high school diploma in Alabama can't write, can't read, and can't do math?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you, Wayne, but not on the record. And you can't quote my name because I'll be fired if they find out who told you this." I said, "Okay, tell me. I'll give you anonymity." He said, "Because the Alabama State High School test is pegged at 5th grade 6th month in math and 6th grade 3rd month in writing." Now I ask you, what good does it do to have 100% people graduate from high school when they read at a 5th grade level? And I've got some reservations about No Child Left Behind, but I'll tell you this. If we do not make sure that every kid who graduates Alabama high schools can read and write and do math at a 12th grade level, there is no future for us, because the South Koreans in Auburn don't have that rule. And the Finns don't have that rule, and the Germans don't have that rule. And we're no longer competing with Georgia. We're competing with South Korea and Germany and Finland. And so we have got to have tough standards. And that brings me to the question of how people can disagree agreeably. And let me start off with 2 fundamental premises that are almost always true in every argument, even the Baptist ones. Number one, you've got traditionalists, and they don't want anything to change. They don't want any new hymn in the Baptist hymnal. They only want the ones that they sang when they were little kids. And they want all the stained glass windows just like they are now, and the carpets and everything else. And the biggest arguments we have at Auburn First Baptist is when we do a renovation of the church about what color to paint the walls and what color to have carpets. And the traditionalists want it the way it was, and the other ones want to innovate. Like, for instance, would it really hurt to have the kind of music played that young people like and attract them to First Baptist, or shall we just have, Mighty Fortress is Our God every Sunday? So they're traditionalists. Okay, then there are the people who are going to drop out of First Baptist if they don't get something different. So is there any way to find common ground? Okay, 431, right? Because you've got people who say, I sell gasoline and I sell hamburgers and I sell antiques, and if people don't come through here, I don't sell that stuff. And they're not going to keep coming through here if they have to queue up 5 miles north of here to get through town. So they're just trees. So just cut them down. And the Auburn Forestry Department says, no, they got roots. And if you widen the highway, it may not kill the tree, but it's going to kill the roots. And, you know, generally speaking, trees die when you kill the roots. So it's going to take a while, but they're all going to die. So here we have this argument. Or, think more largely, preservation. Now, you probably already know, you're pretty economically diversified in Barbour County and Eufaula. You're number one employer, according to the Online Encyclopedia of Alabama. I know it's right because I'm the one who founded it. And I commissioned a really good person to write the articles on Eufaula and Barbour County. And your number one source of income is manufacturing. You have 30% of your jobs are manufacturing. But then next to that is education, social work, and that cluster of jobs. And you got retail. But then you've got this incredible forest area, wild forest area, 11,000 acres up the road north of here. That's just priceless. Then you've got bass fishing. Then you've got recreation. Then you've got, what is it, Blue Lake or Blue? Yeah, okay, which is apparently, I've not been there, but it's apparently just a great place of legend in terms of attracting tourists. And then you've got Lake Point, where I'm staying tonight, because I insisted on staying at Lake Point if possible, because I'm going to leave the money here in Eufaula and not drive home tonight. So I'm going to stay at the park. And so if you put all this together, you've got a pretty diversified economy, a lot more than Monroe County, which had Vanity Fair and Publin. That's it. And Harper Lee, of course. And so you've got something going for you, but you've got two positions. One, preserve everything, which can't happen. And the other is the almighty dollar is what drives everything, and so tear everything down like Auburn has done. If we once upon a time were the loveliest village, I don't know where it went because it ain't there now. It's grubby. When you approach Auburn from almost any angle, it looks like Schenectady or Detroit or San Diego because it's just overgrown and wallowing in itself because we're growing so fast we can't process change. And so the advocates of tradition and the advocates of change fight over the size of buildings and the height of buildings, and we're torn all apart in town, just like Monroeville is. So here's the thing. Sooner or later, you're going to discover what my son from Seattle told me as he drove through today. He said, Dad, this is a beautiful town. And we drove around. He said, you know, I can just see all sorts of young millennium people coming here to start software firms, which is his job. He's vice president of a company in Seattle. And he said, because it doesn't make any difference where you live in the millennial generation. You can do it anywhere. And you look at the houses, and you look at the land prices, and you look at the property taxes, and you talk about the Smith family and the paper they created, and Jay Jason, the kind of incredible leadership he gave this town as mayor. You chose him. And you think of Billy and the banks, and you think of what's happened here, and you've got so much going for you, so much going for you, so much more than most places. But you have a choice. You can be a part of the 22 counties that are growing, or you can be a part of the 50 counties that are dying. That's your choice. Because 2/3 of our counties are going to be effectively dead within a generation. Effectively dead. Because they're not putting money into education, they're not putting money into leadership, and they don't have any vision of who they want to be. And so I've told you tonight who you were, I've told you who you are, and I've told you who you can be. But Wayne Flynt's not going to get you to where you can be. You're going to get you to where you can be. That's the sermon. Now you want an invitation? We'll have an altar call. Amy, what do you want me to do now? You want questions? You want the panel? Okay, good.